to talk about this important research. My name is Alden Woods. I work at UW News at the University of Washington. We're the Central Media Relations Office for the university. We work as a liaison between researchers and reporters, and that goes both ways. So just as we're working here to help our researchers promote their work and get this important work out into the world this morning, in the future and later on today, if you all have more questions or want to set up further conversations, need to get links to stuff like this recording or the press release or something like that, please reach out and we'll be able to get you connected with the right folks. Just a couple of things before I hand it over to our researchers for this morning, or to talk about their work this morning. First, I mentioned this earlier, but you'll notice that this meeting is being recorded, and I know that a lot of folks here have gotten little ping notifications popping up that a lot of folks here are recording this meeting locally on their own devices. So just going to assume that by being here, you're comfortable with being in a meeting that is being recorded. After the fact, when we're done here, we will work to get this processed as quickly as we can. We'll get it uploaded somewhere where we can share out the link. So if you don't have it, or if you want to listen back, send us an email afterward, and we will we'll get that to you as quickly as we can somehow. Secondly, you notice that everybody's microphones are muted by default. Just ask that you keep it that way, at least until we get to the Q&A portion. We've got 15-20 minutes, I would say, of presentations coming up. So if we can get through that as smoothly as possible, we will have more time for questions. I know that there are going to be a lot of questions about this work. So we'll have more time for questions if we can just keep everybody muted, keep everybody's cameras off, please. And then we will be able, we'll call on folks one by one when we get to the Q&A portion. When we do get to that point, if you have questions, we've got the little raise hand button in the taskbar. We also have the Q&A in the taskbar where you can submit questions. I'd ask that you just do it that way so we can avoid getting a million people talking on Zoom at once, and then we won't know who was talking first. Lastly, the researchers worked with 5 transit agencies who also funded this study. We have a lot of attendees from those transit agencies here, along with transit agencies from around the state. You may be wondering what they have to say about this, what their response is, that kind of thing. Those agencies will be talking about all of that with some of their executives in a separate media availability that's going to follow this. That's going to start at 9:50. I believe that there is one for Oregon and one for Washington. So we're going to get things wrapped up at 9:50 so that anybody who wants can bop over to the conference that they're choosing to hear more about that and ask questions from those folks. Great. So now for the reason why you are all here, I'm going to hand it over to our research team. They're all with the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health Sciences, which sits inside of the School of Public Health, the University of Washington. They are Dr. Marissa Baker, Mark Boudreau, and Dr. Chris Weidema, and I'm going to hand it over to them.
All right, I'm going to do a quick presentation here. Let me get this sharing. All right, we're seeing the slides and not my notes. Is that?
Yeah, you're good, Marissa.
Great. Okay. So to start, I want to just say with thanks that this assessment was funded through a contract with Sound Transit, King County Metro, Community Transit, Everett Transit, and TriMet. In addition to Sound Transit, all contributed funding for this assessment. But the findings that I'm going to report here are those of the authors. They don't necessarily reflect the official views or positions of Sound Transit or any of the other agencies who contributed funding to this assessment. So just to start with an overview of what we did, we undertook an exposure assessment for fentanyl and methamphetamine on transit vehicles. So we collected air and surface samples, analyzed them for fentanyl and methamphetamine, and we did that on a total of 11 different buses between the 5 agencies and 19 train cars. We collected samples over 28 nights between March and June 2023. The agency partners helped us identify which routes and runs and times of day to focus our sampling on. We were, looking for when smoking of these substances would be most likely to occur so we could find them. And we collected these samples both at or near the operator and in other areas throughout the vehicle where smoke would be expected to accumulate. As Alden said, we are researchers in occupational health, so our primary interest, and indeed the reason that the transit agencies reached out to us, was to assess those exposures at or near the operator. So some of our key takeaways from our project: we analyzed 78 air samples and 102 surface samples, which were collected from the transit vehicles. Of those 78 air samples, 20 of them, which is a quarter, had detectable fentanyl, and all of them had detectable methamphetamine. Of the 102 surface samples, about half of them had detectable fentanyl, and nearly all of them had detectable methamphetamine. But an important reminder is that just because we can measure it in the lab does not necessarily mean that it's at a level that poses a health risk to operators or riders. Labs can measure very small amounts of things. There's no enforceable state or federal regulations that exist for methamphetamine or fentanyl exposures that occur in a workplace setting. So LNI does not have standards, Oregon OSHA does not have standards, but I will note that they can cite workplaces for other related hazards if these substances are found, or if they think those substances are posing a risk to the operators. When no regulations or guidelines exist, UW researchers recommend controlling exposure to the lowest level that is reasonably achievable. I will also acknowledge that short and long-term health effects of secondhand exposure to these drugs are not well established. This is really a novel exposure in this context, and so there isn't a lot of research as to what levels may cause health effects and after how much time. But at the level seen in this study, there is no clinical evidence of acute medical conditions that would result from these passive exposures. So, such as from touching a contaminated surface or inhaling secondhand drugs that someone in the back of the bus might be using. But I also want to say that this doesn't mean that drug smoke in your workplace poses no risk. Smoke exposure can be uncomfortable, and it can result in a range of different health effects or discomforts. And additionally, observing drug use can be stress-inducing for operators and riders. It can increase feelings of stress, anxiety. It can lead to job dissatisfaction for the operators. And we know that there can be a range of mental and physical health outcomes that are associated with seeing stressful events. And in particular, for individuals who may be in recovery or have family or loved ones impacted by drug use, these feelings could be particularly heightened if you witness this. I also want to be clear about what our assessment did not do. So we did not characterize short or long-term health outcomes that are associated with secondhand exposure to fentanyl or methamphetamine. That is something that still needs to be looked at more closely. We also did not collect internal biomarkers of exposure, such as urine or blood, to understand how much of what was found in the air or on surfaces entered bodies of operators or the public. We're joined today by two medical doctors, Dr. Scott Phillips and Dr. Rob Hendrickson, who will comment on the health aspect of this study after my presentation. So when we think about occupational exposures, we are often looking to compare them to health-based guidance values. So things like OSHA standards, things like Washington LNI standards, Oregon OSHA standards. As I mentioned before, there are no enforceable airborne exposure standards for methamphetamine or fentanyl. However, the Environmental Protection Agency has developed an 8-hour occupational exposure guideline. And this was developed for use for folks working in legal fentanyl manufacturing. So people working for pharmaceutical companies in labs making fentanyl for clinical use. And the level that they have established is seen here. It's 0.1 micrograms per cubic meter. We call this a health-based standard, and that means that this is the level that if you are below this level over a working lifetime, you would not expect to develop health effects due to that exposure. So it's really kind of a, it's not a line between what's healthy and what's unhealthy, but it is a guideline of what, we should be aiming to be below. There are no such guidelines for methamphetamine in air. There are some regulatory values. So these are codified values for surface exposures to methamphetamine. And these differ between the state of Oregon and Washington state. In Oregon, the acceptable level for decontamination, so if someone is going in to decontaminate a manufacturing site, they need to make sure they decontaminate it below the value listed here, 0.5 micrograms per square foot. In Washington state, the acceptable level for decontamination is 15 nanograms per square centimeter. I will say that in Oregon, this value does not apply to transit. It is specific to drug manufacturing sites. However, in Washington, there's kind of unknown applicability of this standard for transit. It's meant for methamphetamine contaminated sites, known drug labs, or transient accommodations, but it's still a useful benchmark for comparison because this is also a health-based standard below which, it would be considered safe for someone to live in a property. There are no such federal or state regulatory values for fentanyl on surfaces. So UW researchers recommend to decontaminate to as low as reasonably achievable. All right, moving into our quick methods and some results for you. So we analyzed 209 samples for fentanyl and methamphetamine. That was 93 air samples and 116 surface samples. Those came from Sound Transit and TriMet trains, King County Metro and community transit buses, and we took some environmental samples out in the community from Seattle and Portland. Starting first with our air samples. So the way we collected these varied slightly by agency and the type of vehicle we were sampling on, but we did consistently collect a sample that's representative of the operator exposure, and then other samples throughout the bus or train. We needed the pumps to be hidden so they wouldn't, scare riders or be tampered with. So that in some ways, it became a bit of a puzzle with figuring out where we could put them and that would be representative of exposure. So this is a big slide, and I'm going to let you look at it for a second, but also remind you that this is table 1 in our final report, which will be coming to you imminently. So if you want to refer back to that, you will be able to. But basically, this summarizes the different the number of shifts that we sampled, the number of vehicles that we sampled on, where we put our air sample pumps, where we collected surface samples, and the time of day that we collected those samples, which was pretty consistently late evening into the night. Additionally, here are some pictures of where we put our air sample devices on buses. You can see that we consistently put one by the operator on their seat, and that's to be representative of their exposures. Others we hid throughout the bus behind signs, behind panels, in vents, etc. And here are some pictures of kind of how we deployed our pumps on trains, and this was the same between TriMet and Sound Transit. You can see this little black panel that was fabricated to put in the door on the operator cab. And so we were able to put a filter device in that pointed out into the passenger area. We were then able to put another pump with a filter inside the cab to be representative of the operator exposure. So a big busy slide with a lot of numbers and results, which again, this is in the final report. So you'll have a chance to fully digest this. But just to briefly walk you through it, I'm going to start on the left where fentanyl is listed. And you can see this is broken down by type of vehicle, whether it's a bus or a train, and location on the vehicle, whether it's the operator or the rear area of the bus or the passenger area of the train. So you can see that for fentanyl, we detected fentanyl at the operator 1 time on the bus and 8 times in the rear of the bus. But none of those samples were above that EPA guideline that I previously described. On the train, of the 17 operator samples we collected, 6 we detected fentanyl. Of the 16 passenger area samples we collected, 5 we found fentanyl. And I will note that on the operator for trains is where we saw our highest fentanyl value, which is at about 80% of the EPA OEL. And we did find 1 sample in the passenger area of a train that exceeded the EPA OEL. On the right side of the table, we have methamphetamine results. It's the same number of samples. We detected methamphetamine in every air sample we collected. And I'll draw your attention to where those highest samples were found. In the rear of the bus was our highest sample, 2.32 micrograms per cubic meter. And the operator sample that was collected at the same evening was our highest operator sample for methamphetamine of 0.86 micrograms per cubic meter. So I encourage you to look at this in the final report. There's also some text to help describe what we see here. We also collected surface samples, as I mentioned, and we collected 2 different types. One were what I call protocoled surface samples. So this is, we cleaned an area when we set up the pump, and then when we came and picked up the pump and got all of our equipment off of the vehicle, we collected a sample from the area we had previously cleaned. So these samples can be interpreted as, did fentanyl or methamphetamine deposit on these surfaces during the work shift? And we collected these samples throughout the vehicle, including near the operator. We also collected accumulated surface samples, a small number, but these were collected without a prior cleaning of the surface. So the interpretation for these is how much fentanyl or methamphetamine has deposited in this location since a previous cleaning. And we typically did not know when that previous cleaning was. These accumulated surface samples were where we found levels that exceeded the Washington decontamination guidance. And here's a few pictures of study staff collecting those wipe samples, those surface samples, both from a bus and from a train. So of our protocol surface samples, we collected 63 on the buses, about half we found fentanyl, and all of them we found methamphetamine. For the trains, we collected 26 samples. About a quarter had quantifiable fentanyl, and nearly all we found methamphetamine, but none of these exceeded the Washington health-based decontamination guideline that I previously mentioned. Here's the info on our accumulated surface samples. We collected only 13 in total, 5 on buses, 6 on trains, but we found fentanyl in 3/4 of them, and we found methamphetamine in all of them. We actually found 2 that were above the Washington standard, and the Washington standard is 15 nanograms per square centimeter, and we found a sample that at about 53 and about 44, so in clear exceedance. The picture on the right shows us collecting these samples. They were collected kind of from inside the ventilation system, so not an area that riders would or many operators would ever handle, but certainly present. You can also see that the removal of this is not assumed to be complete. You can kind of see where I've collected the sample there, and there's still some black residue that remains. We collected background samples as well, as I mentioned, in environmental locations throughout Seattle and in and around Portland. We did not find any fentanyl in the air or on surfaces in Seattle and Portland. We did find methamphetamine on occasion in the air and on surfaces. However, typically it was at levels that were much lower than we saw on transit. There's more information on this in the final report if this is something that's of interest. So moving into the recommendations that we provided to the transit agencies. First, UW researchers stressed that protective measures should be evaluated for effectiveness and done in consultation with all relevant union representatives. Our first recommendation is to upgrade filtration to a MERV 13 or as high as a MERV filter as feasible. These filters are good for smoke and combustion. They also will be great for wildfire smoke and can help with the spread of viral diseases as well. We recommend enhanced cleaning protocols, increasing the frequency, doing more deep cleaning, while evaluating the health and safety needs of the cleaning personnel. and operator training around what are the agency protocols, what should the operators be doing to keep themselves safe, kind of educating them on these drugs, like what are the real risks to them, what are their perceived risks, do they need to use Narcan, how to use it, when to use it, things like that. We recommend mental health supports. As I said, observing drug use at work is stressful and unpredictable. And so it's important for operators to have access to mental health support. And of course, we also recommend continuing to promote and ensure smoke-free workplaces for transit operators. To wrap up, I just want to acknowledge the large team of individuals who made this work possible. They are listed there for you. And at this time, I will hand it over to Alden to continue with the program for this morning.
Thanks, Dr. Baker. Next up, I'm going to introduce Doctors Scott Phillips and Rob Hendrickson, who I've just allowed to, given co-hosting duties, to be able to unmute. There they are. Doctors Phillips and Hendrickson are directors of the Washington and Oregon Poison Centers, respectively. And as Dr. Baker said, they have prepared some remarks on the potential health implications here. Over to y'all.
Great, thank you. Scott, you want me to go this time?
Right.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Rob Hendrickson. I'm the medical director of the Oregon Poison Center, and and Scott is the medical director of the Washington Poison Center. We're physicians that specialize in medical toxicology, which is the clinical study of effective substances on humans, including things like drugs, methamphetamine, and fentanyl. So we were asked to come and comment on the risk of exposure to fentanyl and methamphetamine based on this study. In regards to I should note that we're not transit employees or employees of UW, but sort of independent and hoping to be sort of a community resource to help understand the risks. So in regards to the study finding, while the presence of methamphetamine and fentanyl in a public space clearly demonstrates that someone has been handling or using or smoking those drugs, it's not entirely surprising to be able to detect really trace amounts of those in a public space like this. Anytime someone is handling, smoking, or using drug, there's going to be a small amount identified. And in fact, there has been, you can identify cocaine on dollar bills and other paper money, and that has been evident for decades now. Fortunately, the amount, and that we're really focused on the concentrations of the drugs, the amounts are extremely small. And while, as Dr. Baker said, that we don't have truly applicable EPA and OSHA guidelines, we do have a wealth of experience for dosing of both of these drugs because they're both prescription medications. And based on this, the exposures to the quantities of the drug that are demonstrated in the study do not constitute a risk of drug toxicity. And in fact, in most cases, an exposure would be hundreds to thousands of times lower than what we would expect to cause clinical effects. So, fentanyl and methamphetamine were clearly detected on trains and buses, but the quantity of the drugs found in the study are too small to be a risk for riders and employees from toxicity from fentanyl and methamphetamine. I do want to mention that Scott and I put together what I just said essentially in a letter, and I will provide a link to that letter in the chat. I think, is there a chat or is it just questions and answers?
I believe it's just questions and answers, but I will see. We can send it out to everybody who's here afterwards.
Sure, I'll email it to you.
That'd be great.
Thanks. And Scott, I don't know if you have more to add to that.
No, I think that's great. And, I think Dr. Hendrickson and myself are, firm believers that, we don't support smoking in public places or most places. That's kind of one of the most toxic substances in the world that we face with is tobacco smoke. So smoking is really not something that we would certainly endorse. But of course, we certainly do endorse getting treatment for people that have substance use disorders and providing help for them and their families. I think I would like just to put a little caption on that, and that is the study did not look at medical endpoints. So if you're planning on asking questions about specific health effect, there is no answer from this study. So we will likely speak to that as there's no data to answer that. There might be, depending on the question, but just so you know ahead of time, there may not be an answer because this was not a medical study. This was an environmental sampling study. And I'll give it back to Alden.
Thank you both. Much appreciated. Looking at the clock, we have about 20 minutes for questions. So I think we will open up the floor again. If you have a question, if you're a reporter here and have a question for any of our UW researchers, I'd ask that you either hit the little raise hand button, which would be down in the reactions tab, or drop your question in the Q&A, and then we can call on folks one-on-one, or one by one, I'm sorry. All right, I saw that Jeremy from Como had a question, and let me see if I can find Jeremy from Como in the participants. It might be under Barnett's. There we are. Ask to unmute.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, hi.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Jeremy Harris with Como 4 here in Seattle. One question either for Dr. Barker or either of Dr. Phillips or Dr. Hendrickson. They said that the amounts that were detected were too low to produce any sort of toxicity. Can you give a statement on, though, if there were to be acute exposure to fentanyl smoke, could there be adverse medical effects from that on the driver or passengers, even with the levels detected, or if there was somebody were to eject fentanyl smoke, could that have a health impact on the driver or a passenger?
Well, good question. I think what we have to see is all we can do is comment on the data that was measured. We can't speculate or say that, but based on what was measured in this, we would not expect to see a health effect acutely from these concentrations.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Next, I see Mike Lindblom from the Seattle Times, who I will open up here. Where are you, Mike?
Yeah, good morning. My question is somewhat similar to the last one. It's one thing to have detectors at the train while passively collecting smoke or residues. It's another thing to take a plume or a cloud in the face when you're 10 feet away from the fentanyl smokers in a bus. Do you believe that the exposure levels for a fellow passenger would be the same, less, or similar to what was reaching the detectors?
Hi, Mike. I can answer that question. So we actually put our pumps throughout the trains and buses. So one was always with the operator, which would be, representative of what the operator would be exposed to. We also frequently had them, at least on the buses, they were always in the back of the bus. So where the passengers would typically be sitting. On the trains, we put one in the passenger area closer to the operator cab, but also where the passenger would be sitting. So those could be considered to be representative of passenger exposure. But I also want to note that, passengers spend a lot less time on the bus typically than the operators do. And so our sampling strategy was really to assess work shift exposures. And so for a passenger who, might be on a bus for an hour or even less, that has to be taken into account compared to the operators who could be on them for 8+ hours every day for, weeks and a working lifetime.
you, Mike. Other questions from reporters here? I'll note that the press release and the final report has been published on the UW News website right now. It's at washington.edu/news. If you want to get that pulled up. All right, I saw.
I just
Go ahead, Neil.
unmuted Emil Moffat.
Sorry, and I remuted you. I'm sorry.
I think I'm unmuted now.
Yes.
Yes, this is Emil Moffat from KNKX Public Radio. My question kind of dovetailed off the last answer about long.
Emil, we lost you.
Okay, I'll try this one more time. My question kind of was about the long-term exposure, even at these low levels. Have there been studies done or knowledge of kind of low-level exposure over a long period of time, like you said, 8 hours a day for months or years at a time?
Hi, Emil. Thanks for that question. No, there have not been. And as you can imagine, those studies can be very expensive, much more time consuming to kind of follow people's exposures over a working lifetime and see how it could develop health effects. And so often that's why we kind of think about occupational exposures as different than community exposures, or at least in this case, as different than the exposures that the riders would experience. Because the operators would be on those buses during their entire work shift. There could potentially be multiple smoking events. They would then go to work the next day and potentially experience the same thing over the course of their working life. And so there has not been a study that has looked at kind of chronic lower level exposure in a working population and how that could affect chronic outcomes experienced later in life.
Okay, thank you.
Next to Barnett Parker.
Yeah, this is Jeremy with Como again. One quick question. Can you talk about how the operator input was used in the study, and what did those operators tell you in the research?
So we didn't spend a lot of time getting operator input directly. The agencies, however, were a good source of input for us. And in particular, one place they were very important was helping us identify where we should be sampling and when we should be sampling based on operator reports that had been made to the agency about drug use. So they were able to say, this line, we tend to get the most complaints specifically during these hours. So that's where we should go out and sample so we can make sure that, we're finding this. So that was a really important kind of place of input that we received from operators via their agencies.
Over to Melissa Santos.
Hi there. I also was wondering about the long-term exposure, but that question was answered. I guess rider or a trained rider, how concerned would you characterize, how concerned should you be about this? I mean, it sounds like it's mostly trace exposure, but are there things riders should do to protect themselves, or is it not really rising to the level of concern members of the public getting on the bus?
So I will say that I have and I continue to ride transit, and honestly, I don't take any additional protective measures than I have, previous. So, for the average rider, that's how I feel, is that I continue to feel safe on buses and trains. But as I mentioned, there are differences for operators and riders will be on the train for much shorter periods of time. But of course, riders also could span children and other kind of more vulnerable populations that typically wouldn't be maybe older individuals, younger individuals, folks with pre-existing medical conditions, things like that. So, I think you can always move if you're on the bus and you feel like, it doesn't smell good or you're uncomfortable, when and if you have the option, which isn't always the case, to move or get off and take another bus. There are often reporting mechanisms that the transit agencies have in place for reporting these things. And if you feel like, you've handled something that, or touched something, it never hurts to wash your hands after you get off of transit or just in general. So those are, that's my feeling, is that, for the riding public, the exposures and the concerns are different than those for the operators.
Quick follow-up question for the drivers. I know a lot of drivers still wear masks because of lots of other risks, COVID risks, etc. Is a mask enough to protect drivers from the level of amounts of you're seeing potentially of these methamphetamine and fentanyl? Is that a protection that drivers can take to help with this issue as well?
This is Mark Pedro from the UW, and I would be really careful about recommendations regarding masks and exposures to either methamphetamine or fentanyl. We haven't evaluated that, and mask use is such a variable on what type of mask someone wears and how well it fits. So I would be cautious on commenting on that.
Next to Frank Lindsay.
Hi, it's actually Ryan Harris from Northwest News Radio. So as we've talked about this exposure not causing adverse medical effects, does that include like not getting high while behind the wheel of a bus from exposure, say, to fentanyl smoke?
So, I mean, there are a lot of ranges of health outcomes from nothing happening to overdose. And, as a reminder, even folks who use these drugs recreationally are not taking it with the goal of overdosing. And so it would be very unlikely that there would be enough that would be generated secondhand that could cause an overdose to anybody when the user themselves is not experiencing that, right? But ultimately, I defer to our MDs on kind of what range of health effects could be experienced.
Yeah, this is Rob Hendrickson. I would say that I have no concerns about operators feeling the effects of fentanyl and methamphetamine based on the numbers from this study. That doesn't mean that smelling smoke doesn't have effects. We've all been exposed to smoke of all sorts of varieties and gotten, headache or cough or, mucous membrane irritation and things like that. So I don't want to downplay that in any way. The ideal situation for everyone is that no one is exposed to secondhand smoke at all. But from the standpoint of fentanyl toxicity or methamphetamine toxicity, I feel very comfortable that that is not a risk based on the numbers in this study.
Over to Mike Lindblom.
Yeah, building on Rob Hendrickson's last remark, there are a few dozen incidents of transit operators who have stepped off in their shift or sought a medical exam for things like shortness of breath, tightness, headaches, dizziness, and so forth. I've personally experienced that for a brief amount of time on a bus. What causes those effects, and are they any different with fentanyl and meth smoking than they would be for being aboard a vehicle with tobacco smoking or wildfire smoke?
Well, there are certainly some similarities. Whenever you burn anything, you get particulate matter and things like that. But each of these substances is producing different chemicals, and the active one, the fentanyl or the methamphetamine, is the one that you would get toxicity from those things. But anytime you're heating something, there's going to be a variety of chemicals, and that usually is the thing that leads to the irritation of the eyes and the headache and the nausea and those types of things. And that can be seen from smoke, from everything from tobacco to cannabis to the drugs we're talking about today, or wildfire smoke as well.
Melissa Santos.
Hi, I just want to make sure I'm clear because we were talking about sort of just, handling drugs, having some trace amounts. The amounts that they do indicate is from people actually combusting or lighting up on the trains and buses, or it's not just they did it outside and they came in and, and they carried some of the residue. And there's evidence substantially that these are from people actually using the drugs on the trains and buses. Am I correct?
Melissa, that's a great question, and thanks for letting me clarify that. So in general, when we did our sampling, we set up our equipment and we left, in order us being on the bus with our equipment or on the train could, bias behavior potentially. So in some instances, we have a good idea of what happened, but we certainly don't consistently. At times we had video footage we could rely on, operator report that they witnessed something. Often we would come and pick up our equipment and we would see paraphernalia, either foil or pipes. And so we'd have an idea that this likely happened, but there very well could be instances of someone getting on and maybe some air from the station came in, or from somebody had residue on their person and it could transfer onto surfaces that we sampled. So that's an important consideration, and a limitation of the study is that we don't know exactly what was happening during the time period. And so similar to there might have been nobody smoking, we don't know if it was multiple people smoking that resulted in those values. And that's just unfortunately due to the logistical constraints of not being able to be with our equipment, or being able to consistently rely on video footage or reports to know exactly what was going on.
But your testing of the background, sort of the sort of sample control test background areas on Portland and stuff, it seemed to indicate that it's not like it's just wafting in from the street, right? I mean, there's something happening on these buses at least some of the time that is causing this increased concentration, right?
Yeah, you're right. So again, we also don't necessarily know what was happening with the environmental samples because those were also set up and came back to pick them up. And of course, when you're in an environmental, there's a lot more air movement, a lot more things. So, I would hypothesize that often we were recording smoking events, but not always on the transit.
We probably have time for one last question. Again, we need to wrap at 9:50. And folks, I remind you to bop over to one of the two conferences held by the transit agencies if you would like. Any last questions for our folks here? Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, there was reference in the presentation to MERV 13. How does that compare with what the transit agencies are using? And do you have any idea how much effort and expense are needed to reach that kind of an ideal filtration system?
Yeah, that's a great question to ask the agencies at their upcoming briefing. I know they will have that information for you.
That one was quick, so we have time for one more. All right. Hearing none, we'll wrap here. Again, appreciate everybody making the time this morning. You will likely get a follow-up email from me here very soon that'll have a link to our press release on UW News, which also includes a link to the final report that is contained in there. And also when we have the recording for this available, I will send that out to everybody as well. If you have follow-up questions, most folks who registered for this should have gotten a confirmation email that has my email in it. Feel free to reach out and we can see if we can get your issues solved as quickly as we can. Appreciate it, everybody.